He walked into the courtroom like someone stepping onto a stage he thought he already owned. Dylan Schumaker, barely 16 and trembling on cue, kept his eyes low as if the weight of guilt was dragging his whole body forward. Every step was slow, rehearsed, deliberate. People in the gallery whispered that he looked devastated. Some even wondered if the boy was too young, too fragile, too broken to truly understand what he had done. Tears rolled down his face before he even reached the defense table, and for a moment it looked like the entire room leaned in, waiting to see if compassion would win over judgment. He didn't look like someone capable of violence. That was the unsettling part. His hands shook. His voice cracked when he mouthed, "I'm sorry," toward the victim's family. His shoulders curled inward, the way a kid braces before punishment. If you didn't know the story, you might think he was the one who needed protection. And yet, behind those reddened eyes and those trembling breaths, something else lingered. An eerie confidence, almost a quiet belief that if he just cried hard enough, if he looked young enough, everyone might forget why they were really there. But the judge wasn't watching the tears. Judge Bowler had already heard something Dylan didn't know he knew. Something that would shatter the act playing out in front of the courtroom. A voice recording. A phone call Dylan made from the holding center, long before he stepped into the courtroom sobbing like the world had ended. A private moment where the mask slipped and the real version of him spoke freely. The judge had listened to every second of it, and now Dylan sensed it. Something in the judge's expression, the hardened way he observed instead of reacted, the silent stillness of someone who already knew the ending of a story. Dylan's sobs grew louder, more dramatic, as though he hoped to drown out the truth he feared was coming. Only a few months earlier, he had been just another teenager in Western New York, a kid trusted to babysit while his girlfriend went to work, a kid who insisted he never meant to hurt anyone. But that night, a 23-month-old child lost his life, and the truth of what happened inside that house was far darker than the shaking boy now standing in court. Dylan didn't know it yet, but the tears he weaponized so carefully were about to become meaningless. Because once the judge's voice cut through the silence and that recording was brought to light, everything he thought he could manipulate was about to collapse. Long before the courtroom filled with cameras, grief, and whispers of hope for justice, there was a small house in Western New York where a normal evening had turned into something unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Ashley Smith had left for her restaurant shift believing her boyfriend, young, quiet, seemingly dependable, could handle watching her children for a few hours. She had no reason to doubt him. Dylan had helped before. He'd played with them, fed them, even acted like he cared about being trusted. But that night, something inside him began to unravel. Austin, not even 2 years old, was restless. He cried in that way toddlers do. Sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. In the dim light of the living room, Dylan's patience thinned with every tiny sound. What started as frustration twisted into something darker, something he later tried to call a mistake. He admitted later that he lashed out, hitting the toddler more than once. And when the crying didn't stop, he pushed a pillow over the child's head, trying to silence a sound that had nothing to do with defiance and everything to do with helplessness. He would tell investigators later that he didn't mean to hurt Austin, that he never intended for the night to turn deadly. But the injuries said otherwise. Doctors took one look at the toddler and knew instantly that the explanation Dylan offered, the fall, the accident, wasn't just a lie. It wasn't even a convincing one. Austin's small body was covered in trauma that could only come from violence, not misfortune. And as emergency responders tried desperately to revive him, Dylan stood nearby insisting he hadn't realized his own strength, insisting he lost control, not that he meant harm. Police didn't buy it. The story fractured the moment they asked him to repeat it. And under pressure, he finally cracked. He admitted the anger, the strikes, the pillow. He admitted that for those moments, he couldn't manage his frustration, couldn't see the difference between a child crying and a threat to his pride. By the time he was arrested, the gravity of what had happened still hadn't fully settled in his expression. To the rest of the world, the case was clear. A toddler was dead, and the boy responsible had already confessed. But in Dylan's mind, there was still a path out. A chance to convince the jury that he was just a scared kid who messed up. That if he cried hard enough, they might believe his version of the truth. The only thing he didn't realize was that the truth was already catching up to him, faster than he could ever outrun. By the time Dylan sat in the county jail waiting for his trial, he had already started shaping the version of himself he wanted the world to see. The quiet teenager, the heartbroken babysitter, the kid who made a terrible mistake but deserved mercy. And from behind those steel bars, he rehearsed that image again and again, perfecting the shaky breaths, the tears, the words that might sway a jury desperate to believe remorse was still possible. But jail doesn't give you privacy. Every phone call echoes through recorded lines, every confession or slip of truth captured and stored. And on one of those calls, Dylan let the mask fall completely. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't pleading for forgiveness. He sounded smug, almost confident, explaining to his mother how the courtroom would see him. "I'm a 16-year-old blonde," he said, like it was a strategy instead of a fact. "All I have to do is cry and they'll feel sorry for me." It wasn't fear in his voice, it was calculation. A boy convinced that appearances could overshadow actions, that tears were stronger than evidence, that the right performance could rewrite the narrative of a child's death. And while the guards didn't react, the call didn't disappear. It made its way into the case file, into the judge's hands, and ultimately into the very heart of the trial. Meanwhile, the community surrounding the courthouse felt torn. Some saw Dylan as a kid who snapped, someone whose youth might have clouded his judgment. Others saw him for what the evidence suggested: a teenager capable of violence, manipulation, and an unsettling ability to play the victim in a tragedy he had caused. When the courtroom finally filled for the sentencing hearing, the air felt heavy, charged with anticipation. Dylan shuffled in, eyes already dripping, body trembling as though grief had swallowed him whole. He turned slowly toward the victim's family, his voice small, strained, saying he never meant to hurt Austin, that he loved him, that he would give anything to undo that night. And for a moment, just a moment, some people wondered if maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe he was a scared kid drowning in guilt. Maybe remorse had broken him down into the sobbing figure standing before them. But the judge knew something no one else in the room did. He knew the voice behind the tears. He knew the boy who bragged about his manipulation, the boy who believed he could steal sympathy like it was a prop. The performance was impressive, but the truth was louder, and it was about to echo through the courtroom in a way Dylan never expected. The courtroom had grown so still that even the soft hum of the lights overhead felt loud. Dylan stood there shaking, wiping at tears that kept streaming as if he'd been drowning in guilt all night. His lawyer gently steadied him, whispering something meant to calm him, but Dylan's eyes were locked on the floor. Maybe because looking at anyone else, especially the victim's family, felt too dangerous. Or maybe because he feared what the judge was about to say. Judge Bowler adjusted his glasses and reached for a piece of paper. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, too quiet, and that silence made Dylan finally lift his head. His breathing changed. His hands tightened around the edge of the table. He didn't know what was coming, but something deep inside him sensed it wasn't sympathy. The judge began reading, not from a report, not from a police file, but from a transcript of Dylan's own voice, the recorded phone call he thought no one would ever hear. "I am a 16-year-old blonde," the judge read, each word slicing through the air. "All I have to do is cry in front of the jury, and they're going to feel sorry for me." Gasps rippled from the benches. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Dylan froze. His tears stopped. Not because he didn't want to cry anymore, but because he suddenly didn't know which version of himself he was supposed to be. The judge didn't look angry. That was the unsettling part. He looked disappointed, almost tired, like he'd seen this kind of manipulation too many times before. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, steady, and heartbreakingly blunt. "You are a manipulator and a deceiver." Those words hit harder than the sentence that hadn't yet been announced. Dylan's face changed instantly. This wasn't the script he'd imagined. This wasn't a moment where tears softened hearts. This wasn't where people believed he snapped under pressure or lost control because of inexperience. All the excuses he had relied on felt flimsy now, scattered on the floor like pieces of a mask he couldn't put back on. Across the room, Austin's family listened quietly, their hearts already shattered long before the hearing. They didn't react to Dylan's crying. They had heard enough excuses, enough shifting stories, enough explanations to last a lifetime. The only thing that mattered now, the only thing they waited for, was justice. Dylan began to tremble harder, but not with emotion this time. It was fear, real, unfiltered fear. He understood now that the tears he tried to weaponize were useless. The judge had seen behind the curtain, exposed the performance for what it was. And the boy who walked in believing he could control the narrative suddenly looked small, fragile, and terrified of the truth finally catching up to him. When the judge finished reading the transcript, the entire direction of the hearing shifted. It was no longer about Dylan's trembling voice or his shaking shoulders or the desperate apologies he whispered between sobs. It was about the truth, raw, undeniable, and captured in his own words. Dylan's attorney tried to recover, speaking about his client's age, his lack of experience, the mental health concerns that had followed him for years, but nothing seemed to land. The judge had already seen the real boy beneath the tears, and no amount of explanation could rebuild a sense of sincerity that had shattered seconds earlier. Still, the defense tried. They spoke of impulse, of frustration, of a teenager who didn't understand the consequences of losing his temper. They insisted he wasn't someone who set out to harm a child, that he simply collapsed under stress and acted without thinking. They painted him as a kid stumbling in the dark, overwhelmed and unprepared for responsibility. Even Dylan tried to speak again, voice cracking, insisting he loved Austin, that he wished he could trade places with him, that he never wanted any of this to happen. But the judge's eyes didn't soften, because intent or not, a child was gone. A toddler who couldn't defend himself. A baby who cried because that's what babies do, and was met not with comfort, but with anger. When Judge Bowler finally rose to give the sentence, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Austin's family sat rigid, waiting. Reporters leaned forward. Even Dylan looked up for the first time, his face pale with dread. Whatever hope he had walked in with was hanging by a thread so thin it was barely there at all. The judge spoke about responsibility, about trust, about the brutality of the injuries. He spoke about the danger of someone who could strike a child repeatedly, then attempt to disguise the truth behind rehearsed tears. And then, with a voice that did not waver, he issued the sentence. 25 years to life in state prison. A wave of reactions pulsed through the courtroom. Relief, gratitude, shock. Some nodded slowly, as if justice had finally aligned. Others stared straight ahead, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Dylan, for the first time, stopped crying. Not because he didn't want to, but because the realization hit him with full force. This wasn't a mistake he could cry his way out of. This wasn't a story he could rewrite with performances or apologies. His sister rushed out of the courtroom in tears, insisting he wasn't capable of such violence, that he had simply snapped, that he was still just a kid. But outside those courtroom doors, the world didn't see him as a fragile teenager anymore. They saw the consequences of a night that could never be undone. And as the officer placed handcuffs on Dylan and guided him toward the exit, the room finally exhaled. Justice, in the eyes of many, had spoken. But the story wasn't finished. Not yet. 3 years passed after the sentencing, but the case didn't fade from memory. The name Dylan Schumaker had carved itself into the community's consciousness. A reminder of how quickly trust can become tragedy, how a single night can leave scars that last a lifetime. While Dylan adjusted to life behind prison walls, serving a sentence that many believed was far too lenient for what had happened, lawyers continued to fight behind the scenes. They argued that his age, his mental health history, his lack of criminal background, all of it should matter. That a 16-year-old, no matter how terrible his decisions, shouldn't be condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. And in 2016, a higher court gave its answer. Not freedom, not forgiveness, but a reduction. 18 years to life instead of 25. A decision that immediately reignited the debate that had once shaken the courtroom. Some felt the adjustment was logical. Dylan was barely old enough to drive when the crime occurred, and the law had to account for the undeveloped judgment of youth. Others felt sick hearing the news, wondering how anyone could look at the photos of Austin, at the injuries he suffered, at the life cut short before it even began, and say the sentence was too harsh. To many, the reduction felt like a reopening of old wounds. People remembered the phone call, the casual tone, the manipulative confidence, the belief that tears could mask violence. That recording had become the clearest window into who Dylan truly was in those crucial moments. And because of that, many argued that his age shouldn't erase that truth. Not when a toddler would never get to grow up, laugh again, or live the future he deserved. The case began circulating again online, debated by strangers who had never set foot in the courtroom, each person trying to piece together who Dylan really was. A broken kid who lost control, or a calculated manipulator whose tears were nothing more than tools. Even now, the story splits people down the middle. Some insist the justice system showed compassion in the only way it could. Others believe the reduction was an insult to Austin's memory. What everyone agrees on is this: nothing can bring the toddler back. No sentence, long or short, can balance the scale of a life lost so young. And as the years go by, the question lingers in every conversation, every online discussion, every retelling of the case. Did Dylan deserve mercy because of his age? Or should the original sentence, the one handed down after he stood in court crying over a performance the judge had already seen through, have remained untouched? Only one thing is certain: the debate will resurface again and again, every time someone hears the recording, every time the story reappears, every time people are reminded of a night that should never have happened. The world may never agree, but the memory of that courtroom, those words, and the life lost at the center of it all will never fully fade.